Good morning and welcome to the Consortium for Indo-Pacific Researchers 2023 conference. This is our sixth panel. I am Captain Donnelly. I'm a fellow with the consortium, and I have the great pleasure of moderating the Australia, United Kingdom, and United States, aka AUKUS panel, where we'll be of course discussing AUKUS and the alliances in the Indo-Pacific. Each of our panelists will provide their insight, and afterwards we'll have time for some questions as well. Today, I am joined by Dr. Rajat Ganguly, Dr. Stephen Nagy, and Dr. Peter Dombrowski. Dr. Rajat Ganguly is the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Asian Security and International Affairs and a senior faculty member in the International Relations and Security Studies at Murdoch University, Western Australia. He received his PhD in political science from Donnelly University and has held academic positions at Murdoch University, the University of East Anglia, Victory University of Wellington, the University of South Mississippi, Tulane University, and the University of West Florida. He specializes in international relations, the international security, particularly great power politics, and interstate war, ethnic conflict, and the insurgency movements, terrorism, political violence, India foreign and security policy, and Asian international and strategic affairs. Dr. Stephen Nagy received his PhD in international relations and studies from Waseda University in 2008. His main affiliation is as a professor in the International Christian University in Tokyo. Previously, he was a special research associate at Waseda University and the assistant professor at the Department of Japanese Studies at the Chinese University in Hong Kong. He's also published widely in many peer-reviewed international journals, think tanks, and commercial outlets, some of those being the New York Times, BBC, Japan Times, Al Jazeera, Australia Broadcasting Corporation, and many more. Dr. Peter Dombrowski is the William Ruger Chair for National Security Economics and a professor of strategy in the Strategic and Operational Research Department at the Naval War College. He received his BA from Williams College and an MA and PhD from the University of Maryland. Previously, positions include Chair of the Strategic Research Department, Director of the Naval War College Press, Editor of the Naval War College Review, Co-Editor of International Studies Quarterly, Associate Professor of Political Science at Iowa State University, and Defense Analyst at the ANSER Incorporated. Dr. Dombrowski is the author of over 65 books, monographs, articles, book chapters, and government reports. Gentlemen, thank all of you for being here. And I'll start off with a very brief overview of kind of what AUKUS is. So this quick baseline for our discussion, the AUKUS currently has two pillars. First, support, and of course it's between Australia and the United Kingdom and the United States. But it's to support Australia in acquiring conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines. Second is an agreement to trilaterally develop and provide joint advanced military capabilities, which include either defense through artificial intelligence, also known as AI, hypersonic technology, quantum technology, cyber capabilities, and more that are a little unspecified. So hopefully that opens up the floor for some great conversation between a very stacked panel, I would say. And so I'll open the floor first to Dr. Ganguly for your open presentation, sir.
Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for organizing this panel and giving me an opportunity. This is my first time appearing for the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. So I'm going to talk about, my approach to this is a slightly critical view of, what has been marketed in Australia as the AUKUS deal, which what we have heard is that this is a deal initially for 8 attack nuclear-powered submarines, SSNs, 3 of which, the first 3 of the 8, most likely to be refurbished Virginia-class SSNs from the US probably will arrive in Australia somewhere mid 2030 to late 2030. And then, of course, there's this option of the remaining subs being built in Adelaide using some kind of British, Australian, American technology. The Australian government, the Albanese government, has talked a lot about this now, in the sense that this is a job creator for Australia. There's going to be submarines being built in Adelaide, etc., etc. So this is going to cost Australia somewhere in the vicinity of around 370 billion Australian dollars. Obviously, these things often overrun the budget, so we are thinking it'll be probably upwards of $400 billion eventually. Not to mention that there is a separate agreement to buy 220 Tomahawk cruise missiles to be used in these submarines. Now, while we know that, while we understand the contours of what Australia has agreed, there are several question marks that one can raise about the deal and the reasons, the thinking behind the deal. The first point that I want to make is that when Australia last had a national election, this kind of a massive strategic partnership, this massive investment of money in nuclear submarines, etc., this was not really seriously an election issue. This was never really nationally debated. So when the deal was announced in March of 2023, it almost felt that one has been blindsided by this, sort of came out of the left field, and people were. I mean, my first inclination was one of shock that very few people had actually anticipated something like this, because neither the Liberal government before nor the current Labour government actually talked about this in a major way during the election campaigning. So this was one problem that many of us had, in the sense that we asked the question, why was it suddenly so important for the government to enter into this deal? So in other words, what we were trying to ask is, what is the threat perception? Can you clarify for us what Australia's threat perception is? And in the press, a lot of people talked about the China threat, saying, we are buying these nuclear subs, we are getting into this agreement because there is a China threat. So if you unpack the China threat a little bit, I think what you get is something slightly different. So if you ask the question, is there a physical threat from China to Australia, in the sense that, is there a threat that the Chinese military will physically invade and occupy Australia and so on and so forth? The answer clearly is no. The Chinese are not going to do that. On the contrary, many strategic analysts in Australia made the argument that if the Chinese do pose a threat to Australia, those threats probably are more likely in the cyber domain, in the space domain, and perhaps even in the economic domain. So cyberspace and economic areas probably are more vulnerable when you look at it from the Chinese threat perception, rather than being physically invaded and occupied by the Chinese, unless the Chinese have gone completely insane, which I'm sure they haven't. So then comes the question of, okay, so why are we buying the subs then? Should we not spend the money in cyber defense, or on space programs, or on building up our economic, or overcoming our economic dependence on the Chinese market and so on? Should we not diversify, spending money elsewhere? So then we were told by the government and by some pro-government analysts that no, we need to buy these nuclear subs because we need to keep the sea lanes open in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific Ocean, because this is the lifeblood of the global economy. We need to keep the commercial sea lanes of traffic open, free, etc., from PLA Navy disruption. So the argument was that the PLA Navy's footprint is growing in the Indian Ocean. Indian Ocean is the biggest commercial shipping lane, as you know. and we need to have our own submarine presence so that the PLA Navy can't do any mischief. The counter argument to that is that, again, why would the Chinese disrupt commercial traffic in the Indian Ocean? Because it is this commercial traffic which passes through the Indian Ocean, through the Strait of Malacca, which is the lifeblood of the Chinese economy at the moment, because most of this traffic is going to China. It comes through the Indian Ocean, goes through the Strait of Malacca, and then up the South China Sea to the eastern coast of China. So again, unless the Chinese are suicidal, they are hardly likely to disrupt this free commercial traffic in the Indian Ocean. On the contrary, one could argue that China's strategic dilemma is what is called the Malacca choke point, that in the event of heightened tensions with the United States, the US Navy acting together perhaps with the Australian Navy, the Indian Navy, could easily blockade the Strait of Malacca, which then would create problems for China, because most of the commercial traffic going to China actually passes through the Strait of Malacca. And this perhaps also explains, in a sense, why the Chinese are so insistent that they build multiple points of entry into China, which is part of President Xi Jinping's One Belt, One Road initiative. They're building the port of Gwadar because they want to bring goods and services into Pakistan and through Pakistan into Western China, etc., etc. So this idea that the Chinese pose a threat, and to counter this threat, we need to have nuclear submarines, 8 attack submarines, is a kind of securitization that has been done by the Australian political elite, which appears to many of us to be flawed in terms of its basic logic. The other thing to keep in mind in this discussion is that Australia's Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, has often said publicly that any military deployment, whether by Australia, by the United States, in the Pacific Ocean, in the Indian Ocean, etc., that if we keep doing that, then this actually creates more possibility of conflict with China. That the more deployment we have in these areas, the more will be the friction points, and the more friction you have with the Chinese, the chances of a flare-up are actually higher. And her argument has been that this is something that we should actually try and avoid, because China's military might is growing. We don't want to get into a eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation with the Chinese military, speaking from Australia's point of view. And the other point she made often in discussions was that if we were to run freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, we run it anyway. We don't need nuclear submarines to run phone-up operations in the South China Sea. The American Navy, the Australian Navy, they run phone-up operations in the South China Sea even as we speak. So if you want to make a case that we need nuclear subs to run phone-up operations in the South China Sea, and then that probably is a little bit of an oversell or overkill in a sense. Now, some of us who have criticized or looked at this deal in a slightly critical way, we have also made the point, myself included, that this deal, if it goes forward, it creates further problems for Australia. So, three problems one can talk about in a nutshell, and I'll be very quick about it. The first one is, as you mentioned in your introduction, that Australia would be buying 8 nuclear attack subs and fit them with conventional missiles, conventional weapons. Now, my understanding is that nuclear attack subs were basically built for one purpose, and that was stealth, which basically meant that they were built to carry nuclear weapons, because they provide the nuclear triad, in the sense that these attack subs are very hard to find. They can stay submerged for long periods of time, and it is this quality of these subs that gives deterrence the kind of credibility that you want when you carry nuclear weapons. So, and if you look at the other countries that have nuclear subs, all of them actually carry nuclear weapons rather than conventional weapons. So Australia, if it carries only conventional weapons, my sense is it'll be the first country to have nuclear subs carrying conventional weapons, which makes little sense to me in a sense. So that's number one. Number two is that if Australia really gets these nuclear subs from the mid-1930s onwards, then there will be two immediate issues in terms of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. Australia may have to come out of the NPT. Australia is a signatory to the NPT, so it may have to say that now that we have nuclear subs, everybody's assumption will be that these subs are carrying nuclear weapons. So you would have to convince other partners that you may have nuclear subs, but you're not carrying nuclear weapons. Whether that's a strong argument or not, I don't know. But chances are that there will be some problems with the NPT commitments that Australia has, and Indonesia already has picked up on that. So the day the AUKUS deal was announced, within a week, Indonesia said that we are very, very disturbed by what Australia has done. This will have long-term ramifications in terms of the NPT in the Indo-Pacific. So that's one. The second, of course, would be, as some critics have said, that right now, because Australia is a non-nuclear weapon state, everybody knows that Australia has no nuclear weapons. If you accept that China, North Korea, Russia are hostile countries and they all have nuclear weapons, they are probably not targeting Australia with any of their nuclear missiles. Because for a nuclear weapon country to target a non-nuclear weapon country with nuclear missiles is almost considered a no-no in international politics. So we can assume that China or North Korea or Russia, for that matter, they do not target Australian cities with nuclear missiles. But this game might change the moment these countries come to believe that Australia now has nuclear subs, and the whole purpose of a nuclear sub is to carry nuclear weapons. So if they don't believe your argument that these subs don't carry nuclear weapons, they might still assume the worst, and Australian cities or Australian towns may come under their nuclear targeting. So that's something that the government will have to tell the people eventually, whether we are being targeted or not. And lastly, what I would say is that if you look at Australia's ties with major commercial trading partners, economic partners in the Indo-Pacific region, Australia is very fast acquiring a reputation, an image that it is becoming a US military base in some senses. There are already US soldiers present in Australia, up north in Darwin, and so on. And many Australian critics of this deal basically saw this as America's deployment, America and Britain's deployment in the Indo-Pacific for a future day war with China and North Korea. And they're using Australia as a forward base, as a forward, sort of staging the war in the Pacific through Australia. And a lot of people here are uneasy about that, simply because the argument is, a confrontation with China or a confrontation with North Korea is not in Australia's national interest. And people have raised this question that, when you get so closely tied with America's global interest and Britain's global interest or NATO's global interest, you often get sucked into conflicts and wars that have very little to do with your national interest. So for example, what was Australia's national interest in Afghanistan? What was Australia's national interest in Iraq? We were involved in both wars simply because of alliance commitments that we couldn't say no because of the alliance. So the argument here is, I think the unease that is being formed in Australia in some quarters is that, yes, it could be good politically to build ties with the US and with the West. It would be good perhaps commercially in terms of creating jobs, so on and so forth. The Australian Navy, the Australian military probably supports it very much because this means bigger budgets for them and so on. But then if you sort of kind of compare it with what is Australia's real interest, many people would say the real interest is commercial ties with China, economic relationship with China, commercial economic ties with partners in the Indo-Pacific. many of them are very upset. Many of them are very unsure. And I have heard from several people that this could open the floodgates to a new kind of arms race in Asia and in the Indo-Pacific, and that probably would destabilize the region significantly. So while we are talking about freedom of navigation, rules-based order, countering China, this and that, there are in the background some of these difficult questions. This sense of unease about a deal, which was sort of pushed through the back door in a sense, because this was never really nationally discussed, never debated. And my sense is that both the previous government, when Scott Morrison was prime minister, and now with Albanese, they have not done a very good job of actually selling the deal to the Australian public. And one last comment on this is, you may remember that former Prime Minister Paul Keating has come out and absolutely savaged this deal, saying that this is the worst thing that Australia could have done. So I rest my presentation there. I'll be happy to answer questions in the Q&A.
Purely for time, I think we're going to hold questions until the end because Dr. Ganguly, the questions that I've written down probably could fill up the rest of the time. So to respect Dr. Dombrowski time, I'll pass it over to you, sir, so then we can allow you some time to talk to.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Dr. Ganguly and I didn't coordinate, but there was actually a very nice division of labor in our two presentations, because Dr. Ganguly focused on what's called Pillar 1 of AUKUS, which is the submarine part, and the strategic dimensions and the Australian dimensions of AUKUS. And I'm going to take a different approach, which is complementary with his presentation. I'm going to focus on Pillar 2, and I'm not going to focus on the internal dynamics of Australia, the United States, or Great Britain, although that's a worthy topic that we should, absolutely discuss and happy to talk about. But I'm going to focus on the sort of regional dimensions of this defense arrangement and its impact on friends and neighbors within the wider Indo-Pacific of the countries involved in the trilateral relationship. So I think there's actually a nice symmetry in our presentations. That said, I want to just clarify one thing, and this is something we can talk about in the Q&As. I work for the Navy, so these things matter to me. Many of the points Dr. Ganguly raised about nuclear-powered submarines and proliferation and threat perceptions are on point, but I just want to make one point of clarification. So in most navies that have nuclear submarines and let me just put it this way. There are two general kinds of submarines. There's SSBNs in the American parlance, which are nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed subs. And then there are attack submarines, which are SSNs, and these are, in the American Navy, nuclear-powered, conventionally armed systems. That mostly holds true for other navies as well, right? So they have attack submarines, whether they're nuclear powered or conventionally powered, but they're not armed with nuclear weapons. Now, Professor Ganguly is correct. There's a discrimination question there. Which sub has what weapons? And it's a very secretive program. You don't see these things, and nobody allows inspections of U.S. submarines. But at least within the conventional parlance of navies, there's two kinds: SSBNs that are nuclear powered and designed to shoot nuclear weapons, and there are SSNs which are either conventionally powered or nuclear powered, and they are designed not, at least in the first practice, to have nuclear weapons. Okay, and it's a very complicated subject, but I just want to make that clear, and we can talk about the implications in the Q&A. The last thing I'll say before I actually talk about the formal talk is you're actually seeing the beginning of a much wider research project. The presentation I give in is sort of the very first ideas for a chapter in a larger book project. So I'm hoping to get feedback, because this is going to be something bigger in the long run, and I'm at the very beginning of the research journey. So I'm going to share slides. I hate to be the slide guy, but in this case, I thought it was appropriate. So I'm going to try to share the screen. And if I'm unsuccessful, just be patient and I will do it quickly. Okay. Can everybody see that? Give me a thumbs up. Thank you.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, good. So as trying to make this full screen, just be patient with me. Okay, good. So strengthening security alliances, strengthening security and alliances, that's the panel of the topic of the panel, and I'm going to focus on AUKUS Pillar 2. So that's where I come into something a little bit different than Professor Ganguly's presentation. Because of the topic and because I work for the U.S. government, I have to give a disclaimer. So nothing I say here is the position of the U.S. government, the United States Navy, the Naval War College, or any other department of agency. Right? I'm speaking for myself as an analyst, scholar, there's nothing official about what I say. That should be obvious, but I need to say it because that's part of the rules for me to do these kind of talks. Okay, so this is just the basics, and I'm going to be very quick here because, oops, I'm sorry. Let's see if I can go back. Yeah, so most of this was covered by Dr. Ganguly and in the intro by Captain Donnelly, but I'm going to put a little different spin on it. So it is a trilateral security arrangement, partnership. I don't think it's quite an alliance, although these countries have other dimensions of an alliance, but this particular initiative is a partnership. It was officially announced, and I got a typo already, on September 15, 2021. That's important, as I'll come back to it in a minute. And the one thing that Dr. Ganguly didn't talk about, because he had such a detailed presentation, but I just think it's important for thinking this through, is this complex origins of the first pillar, the submarine pillar of AUKUS. And it's complex in terms of the international and alliance dimensions, and it's complex in terms, and I have Austria too. Wow, this is bad. Excuse me. On Australia, because the submarine part of the pillar, Pillar 1, is part and parcel of a reaction to longstanding efforts for Australia to upgrade its submarines. And much of this was involved, at least in the last decade or so, with the failures of Australia's indigenous submarine industrial base, and then partnerships with sharing of technology, sharing of production, and so forth with France. But that program was plagued with problems and cost overruns and delays, and Australia decided to abrogate the relationship with France and enter into this relationship with Great Britain and then later the United States. Now, the French deal, and I don't want to talk too much about this, and I'm not an expert in it. It's much more complicated than just, France providing submarines. There's manufacturing agreements, there's technology sharing, and there's all kinds of other dimensions of that relationship about spending and the system itself, the attack class submarines that were based on an earlier French design that were going to be built for Australia, actually had weapons and technologies from other countries, namely the United States and Great Britain, because Australia had decided that different components of other submarines were more useful for their strategic needs. Okay, so, but there was displeasure with the cost, displeasure with delivery, displeasure with the way that relationship worked out. Australia abrogated the agreement, and this is the AUKUS Pillar 1 is sort of the stepchild of this initial program. But that's important for a bunch of reasons that I think will become clear later. But I want to say something about the politics. So obviously, it was a big deal for France. There was withdrawal of ambassadors. There was very frigid relationships. And at least in terms of overall alliance relations globally, not just the Indo-Pacific, and the wider relationship between democracies in this space, this was an earthquake, and there was a lot of angst all around about how these relationships were evolving. So this has all been said, but I'll just be quickly. So Pillar 1 is the submarines. That's actually language from a fact sheet that's up on your screen under Pillar 1 from the fact sheet provided by the US government. And then Pillar 2, highlighted in yellow, is what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the presentation. And this is advanced capabilities. And I'm just going to read it because I want to say something about it. AUKUS will develop and provide joint advanced military capabilities to promote security and stability in the Pacific region. Now, this is a very sort of anodyne kind of basic statement. What does it say? I'm going to make an argument that in some ways, for the region, for other partners and allies of the United States, Australia, and the UK, but also for just simply the evolution of the region, may in the long run be more significant and more, I hate the word, but impactful on security relationships in the region, and still more importantly, on economic growth, technological innovation, and not the geoeconomic competition with China. And that's kind of the premise of my argument, and I'll try to talk you through my logic in the next slides. So Captain Donnelly already raised this, but I want to, so these are the Pillar 2 advanced capabilities. And as Captain Donnelly noted, you know, they're a little bit vague. We can talk about that and why. There's some things here that are not like others, like innovation and information sharing don't fit with the specificity of electronic warfare and hypersonics and counter-hypersonics. So it's a bit odd. I think there's reasons, and you know, one of the things I do know is that some of these quote-unquote advanced capabilities were added on later after the initial agreement and the initial division into Pillars 1 and Pillars 2 was decided upon early on. So they were kind of, you know, and I don't want to characterize this too heavily. There was an exploratory and evolutionary dimension within the AUKUS partners about what made sense. So leaving aside the submarines, in the advanced capabilities pillar, there's been sort of a growth in the interest and growth in the advanced capabilities that the three countries agreed to collaborate on and cooperate on. I highlighted 4 of these capabilities in yellow, and I want to explain that. So all of these have some dual use commercial applicability. They're not just defense technologies, well, maybe hypersonics, but they have a much broader set of interactions with the commercial sector, with commercial innovation, with economic competitiveness at a large scale. So, you know, the highlights are sort of the capabilities I'm going to focus on with significant dual use and/or commercial application. And that's why, in the long run, my argument is going to be that this is sort of the hidden or less well thought of pillar of AUKUS, but over time, it may have a greater impact because it will solidify information sharing, innovation within the three partners, and potentially, not necessarily, but potentially exclude or minimize the sharing and the commercial applications for other key partners of these countries, right? It's not intentionally so, at least as near as I can be said, near as I can determine at this stage of my research, but there is a real potential because each one of the highlighted capabilities here, it's not government alone. It's defense firms, it's commercial sector firms. So many of the significant developments, just to take in artificial intelligence and autonomy, for example, aren't driven by defense industry research. It's actually driven by the commercial sector. The most innovative and the most money, the most investments are actually on the commercial side, not on the government side. And it's not just in the three partners, it's in France and China and Japan and India and lots of other advanced economies. So this focus between the three partners, depending on how it develops and is implemented, may have a much wider impact over the long run. So let's just, and again, I didn't, write words. I just kind of gave you some of the definitional stuff, and these are slides that it's impossible to read, but just let me just talk about quantum technology. So, in general, quantum technologies is sort of three tranches. There's quantum computing, there's quantum sensing, and there's quantum, I just had a brain lock, encryption, right? And there's a serious technological race between most of the advanced countries, but particularly between the United States on quantum. And in this trilateral partnership, they focus on sort of the maritime security dimension, which is positioning, navigation, timing, and what quantum can do in those defense roles. However, each one of these issues, particularly in the wider quantum space of computing, sensing, communication / encryption, it's not just defense oriented. And again, the leading firms are often not defense industrial firms. And it has, if you think about, and a lot of people have jumped on the quantum train, if you will, in thinking about the future, emerging technologies. A lot of people also think that this is really, with artificial intelligence, the thing that'll drive economies in the future, not just defense industries, not just security arrangements, but economic growth and innovation. And so the three partners are going to integrate these trials. They're going to work together. They're going to cooperate. They're going to collaborate. They're going to share. Depending on how this plays out in the long run, this almost de facto excludes other partners, or at least excludes the part that are under the arrangement of the tripartite partnership. Artificial intelligence and autonomy. We could talk all day about the application to military functions and how important it is. People are far smarter than me think artificial intelligence might be the single biggest, people talk about revolutions in military affairs and military technical revolutions and military transformation. At the heart of the matter today, with the contemporary thinking in Washington, I suspect in Australia and in Great Britain too, not to mention in Beijing, there's a doubling down on the requirement for autonomy. And I can talk, and for artificial intelligence and autonomy. Autonomy includes things like uncrewed, unmanned systems, and so forth. And the reason they think this set of technologies and the collaboration between the three partners is important, because it at least in theory, improves speed and precision of decision. Meaning, if there is, God forbid, an attack on one of the partners or on a key ally or a partner or something, the ability of, in whatever scenario you want, I'm not talking about an invasion of Australia, but just sort of a general regional sort of security issues, AI will lead to greater speed and greater precision of decisions. And it also helps significantly, and Professor Ganguly brought this up, with the cyber piece, which is, in my mind, is not just about sort of cyber offensive missions, but it's about resilience and defense. It's about defending not just military systems, but the commercial cyber applications within society. AI-enabled systems are essential in today's world to defending against cyber attacks. So again, to continue the theme, there's a close relationship between the defense capabilities focused on in AUKUS and wider societal issues and government issues in providing for the security of their populations. The other two, these are the two of the things that are not like the others. They're not really defense technologies, advanced capabilities, but they're really kind of procedural or conceptual ideas. And, it's become commonplace, and I've written a lot about this in past years. There's a tremendous focus, not just in the defense sector, but in the commercial world, on innovation. That innovation is the way to economic growth. Innovation is the way to wider prosperity. Innovation does lots for our populations. And to do this, we need to integrate commercial technologies. Now, this is actually a two-way street. It's not just take commercial technologies, integrate them into the defense sector. Oh, that's the thrust of this partnership. But there's a flow in the other direction. If you look at it historically, the defense sector and national government's investment in things like innovation also help, not the primary driver, but help drive commercial investments. This has become less true in recent years. Happy to talk about that, but certainly at the beginning of the internet age, at the beginning of the computing age, public investment, defense investment in innovation, in certain kinds of advanced technologies, emerging technologies, greatly shaped the world we live in today. And I suspect, in some basic level, this partnership, depending on how it develops and if other countries are added and how they interact with some of the other countries in the region and globally, will help shape commercial innovation because of the government investment, because of the government interest. I can't speak to Australia and the UK as well as I can to the United States, but certainly in particular, very specific areas, the government isn't the driver of research and development, science and technology work that it was in the 50s and 60s. But in certain key sectors, very advanced computing, very powerful supercomputers, AI, it is a player in terms of helping the university system and the commercial sector with investment, with technological challenges, with employment, helping educate engineers. I mean, and as some of you know, the competition for engineering and computer scientists and other kinds of STEM workers is intense, not just in the commercial sector, but in the defense sector, in amongst the defense industry. Now, just to go on to information sharing, again, not like the others, it's not a capability, it's sort of a pledge. It's a statement of intent on the part of the three partners. I just highlight sharing of sensitive information. This is one of the ways that this, in the long run, can turn into something I don't think it was intended to do. It's a way of excluding because, if you follow defense issues closely, one of the big areas is security. And the security of sharing with other countries, from Britain to the United States, from Australia to the United States and with the other partners, but also with France, with Germany, with Japan, with India. This is the stuff, the underlying tectonic plates of the long-term defense relationships. The weapons are very sexy, they're very interesting, they're kinetic, they have proliferation issues, that is submarines, SSNs and SSBNs, but almost all of the weapon systems are based on fundamental research and development, science and technology. And this partnership is starting to make headway in this area. So I don't want to drone on too long. Let me just say a few things. So I put the term implementation here in the header slide because, like I said at the very beginning, the date of the start of this is pretty significant. It's 2021. Are we 2 years into this? This is really complicated stuff, even amongst the closest of partners. And, as you all know, Britain, Australia, and the United States are very close because they're Anglo-American, because they're democracies, because there's at least some, and I think Dr. Ganguly is right. The threat perception is a big issue, but at least some baseline, there's a growing consensus about the threat posed by a resurgent China with a modernized and growing military. Like, I agree. I don't think anybody thinks that China is going to do an amphibious invasion of Australia in our lifetimes, but certainly there are other areas and other scenarios like Taiwan, the South China Sea, East China Sea, and India, China, where you can imagine that the rub between the contest, the competitiveness, the conflict between China and its neighbors might become, in the jargon of the trade, kinetic, or certainly might invade hard security issues. So this the threat perception is really important, but in the long run, the implementation is about, and the pillar 2 is about this long-term, meeting the long-term challenge of China, because we all have heard a million times, the Chinese growth rate is far greater. The number of Chinese engineers is better. I never looked this number up, but I'm pretty sure if you added all the engineers in the United States up with all the engineers in Australia and all the engineers in Great Britain, and then added all the professors and computer scientists, China would, double or triple the numbers of sheer expertise. And this is the kind of long-term competition that's not about the kinetics and not about the submarines, but is about how this threat evolves in the future. But it's really difficult. Only 2 years into this partnership, I'm just going to use the United States example, but I know it's similar in Australia and in the UK. It's a complex regulatory and legislative environment. There are tremendous bureaucratic impediments, even with such close friends and allies as these three. I just gave you a jargony term. One of the examples is, there's a whole set of, it's a legislative package, executive branch initiative to sort of get, clear out some of the difficulties with defense trade, technology sharing within the AUKUS countries. It's not so simple as the president negotiating this agreement, and it has to be implemented within the bureaucracy, and it's really complicated because there's a lot of rules in defense sharing. And it's even more complicated because you need to share with the private sector, because the private sector engagement and investment drives many of these advanced capabilities. The three countries alone on things like AI and cyber capabilities, which is one of the other pillars, the private sector far outspends the government. So if you're going to have innovation, you're going to have defense sharing on these capabilities, you need the private sector, which makes implementation of the agreement really complicated and makes it international, because many, if not all of these firms have international marketplaces, have arrangements with China, with EU countries, with Japan, with South Korea, with Singapore, and sorting out the different aspects of defense cooperation with the three partners necessarily involves these other countries, because that's the way the firms operate. That's where their market is. That's how they're actually organized. So there's very few firms in any country that simply, have all their facilities, R&D, S&T, production, manufacturing, design in one country. Almost all of them are global, and many of them are regional. And this complicates this advanced capabilities pillar. So I didn't develop this very much because this is a first, and I'm almost done if you're worried about time. Implicit tiering. So, one of the longstanding NATO problems going back many decades is that all NATO's members are equal, except for they're not. On many issues, there's tighter relationship between individual countries or groups of countries. The capabilities of NATO members differ greatly, and on some particular defense challenges, a small handful of countries will lead, and everybody else either follows or is part of the resistance. And I'm being funny about that. There is a tiering. So, in NATO, it's the French and the British and the Germans for obvious reasons. That's historically. But in the current period, the frontline states in the dealing with Russia, the Central and Eastern European states have come to the forefront, not because they're wealthy and not because they have the best militaries, but because they have a threat, and their threat perception is very different. So my point is, with this new defense arrangement between two extraterritorial countries and one regional power, might lead to tiering amongst the partners and allies coping with regional security in the Indo-Pacific. That some countries are more equal than others, that some countries have a greater stake or greater investments or more collaboration. I can talk about this in the Q&A, but the problem with that is that if there is a serious conflict with China, and I certainly don't expect it and don't hope for it, but if there is, that's what defense planners do. They think about the worst case. the region does need to be unified, or it'll certainly be more capable of resisting whatever the challenge is, if it's more unified. And my fear is, and we're still early, it's hard to say, is that this kind of arrangement creates an implicit tiering within the region. Pillar two, some other sort of externalities, if you want to put it that way. So other countries have recognized, not on the submarines, but particularly on Pillar two, that they might want to get involved, that the benefits of looking at these advanced technologies are really important, and they'd like to be part of the team. So Canada and some people in the Canadian and Japanese defense communities, not necessarily the government, at least not publicly, have said, like, maybe we should join AUKUS. AUKUS should have more acronyms. It's not because they want to develop or share, or a program to share nuclear-powered conventionally armed submarines, what I call SSNs. They're either not sufficiently advanced in terms of the defense industrial system, the submarine defense industrial system, or they just have no pressing strategic requirement for this kind of weapon system. Rather, they see the benefits of joining with leading nations in these 8 advanced capability initiatives. They see the advantage in the defense side, and they see the advantage in the commercial side. They see the advantage in the private sector side. So they're concerned, in effect, if they don't say it, with being left behind as collaboration between the 3 partners works. Okay, so what's my argument? This is kind of the reveal at the end, and I'm done after that. Oops, I'm sorry. Both pillars of AUKUS are a clear sign of the global cooperation. And Professor Ganguly did a really good job of laying out the submarine dimension, the strategic, particularly in the Australian context. Happy to talk about that. But, you know, I'm going to focus on this last part. Remember, 2 of these powers are extra regional. They're not even, I mean, they both have some territories and long-standing histories with the region, but they're not directly threatened by China, at least at a territorial or a direct war conflict. And it's, for the Americans in particular, and for the British, it's actually a war. You know, if there was, God forbid, a war, it's a war of choice. But how successful AUKUS is in deterring PRC, People's Republic of China, aggression, and preparing for the possibility remains to be seen. But for non-AUKUS extra-regional players, France, for example, EU countries, NATO out-of-area involvement, in the regional neighbors of the PSC, there are potential doubts about this. There are challenges to AUKUS. Again, it's less about cooperation in submarines, because few have aspirations to have nuclear-powered submarines. It's tremendously costly. It's tremendously difficult. That's why even conventional submarines, for most countries, is beyond their capabilities. It's great powers like India. It's great powers like Japan. But most countries, it's just, especially the nuclear power part, it's almost impossible. Several of, as I've already said to close, several advanced capabilities have implications beyond national and regional defense. Implications for economic growth, global trade and investment, not just in the defense sector, although it's very important there too, but in wealth creation in non-member national economies. So here's kind of the punchline to where the book goes. And I hate the jargon, but I'm going to use it because I haven't thought of it better. You know, over the last decade, particularly in the capitals of the 3 countries we're talking about, but some other capitals, Delhi, in Tokyo, maybe even in Berlin, certainly in Paris, it's been common to talk about great power competition, and great power conflict, and great power war. But the new organizing defense concept in a macro is great powers. And when they say great powers, yes, they mean all, you know, the major players, but they really mean China. My argument, and I'll elaborate in further work, is underlying the great power conflict. You know, I hate this jargon. I borrowed it from a colleague of mine. Great systems, socio-technological competition. Socio-technical competition combined with economics. The challenge of China is less on the defense side. It's onto the fact that they are an economic superpower already, and may very well become, if not already, the leading economic power in the global trading system, the global financial system. And this has deep implications for all of our countries. Okay, sorry I talked so long. I hope it was useful, but it was, I think, complimentary to Professor Ganguly's talk.
Please don't be sorry. I wanted to extend your time, and I think one of the big takeaways from the both of you is that this conversation shouldn't be over. I know we only had an hour, but the points that both of you gentlemen made are beyond the scope of just talking for 1 hour. And so I guess I'll add with just to close because we're coming up on our time, but one quick question and to request a 2 minute like elevator pitch answer. If you could focus on one point. But what we've seen is with AUKUS, there's Chinese rhetoric that says that that AUKUS is going to fail. There's too much difference between the different countries. There's not funding for AUKUS from the United States going on right now. So that's kind of some of the rhetoric coming out of China. Out of the United States, some even say that a non-military solution should be the way, a more peaceful and neutral resolution should be the way that the United States gets after the Indo-Pacific region. And the U.S. government still pushes that AUKUS is going to stabilize the region. So we have three different avenues where the Chinese, the United States people, and the government kind of go in three different directions. So in a quick pitch, what is, I guess, a key point that you see in the future for AUKUS as a quick elevator pitch?
You want me to go first?
Go ahead, please.
All right. So I think my feeling is, and I've spoken to a lot of people in Asian countries about AUKUS, I sense there is a sort of Asian perception developing on this, which is that AUKUS could be sort of a backdoor entry of NATO into the Indo-Pacific. And I think Professor Dombrowski kind of touched upon it, that war planners think way ahead of time. So if you are preparing in a sense for an eventual clash with China at some point in the future, God forbid, I hope it doesn't happen. But if it does, then you need to have your all your priorities in place so that you are not caught unprepared in that. If you look at the map, then both Britain and the United States are actually quite far from Asia, whereas countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, these are much closer, and therefore these could be, including even Philippines. I mean, America has just, I think, signed a deal to build 4 more military installation in 4 islands in the Philippines. So some of that positioning that is going on gives people in Asia at least a sense that this is all about a Western move led by the United States to somehow counter China, to be prepared for China. And the flashpoint may be Taiwan, and it could be a war over Taiwan. I don't know. But the perception is gaining ground in parts of Australia and definitely in Asia, that this is extension of NATO into Asia through the back door. And if you look at NATO, then apart from the US and the UK, the other players of NATO are not really that significant players in Asia. France pretty much has a Indo-Pacific strategy, but compared to the US and UK, Australia probably is at a much lower level. Germany is now pretty much a bankrupt country. It's economically retracting probably because of the Ukraine war, and not probably in a position to do much in terms of Indo-Pacific. So NATO effectively is now an American-British operation with NATO partners in Asia. So there are 4 NATO partners: Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. There was actually quite a big move, I think, on the part of NATO, which has kind of slipped under the radar a little bit, that they wanted to bring India in as a NATO partner in Asia. And my information is that New Delhi basically, wanted NATO to back off a little bit, because India always has argued that it wants to maintain its strategic autonomy, etc., etc. Which is why I think India also has focused more on the non-military dimensions in terms of the Quad experiment, which is the other experiment that we haven't talked about. Japan, America, Australia, and India in the Indo-Pacific. So India's take on the Quad is actually very different from Australia's take or America's take or Japan's take on the Quad. So there's a perception that, look, because of China's rise, because of now growing axis between China and Russia, perhaps even including Iran to some extent, all of this is making the United States very nervous. This is going to be, to borrow Graham Allison's much quoted book, the Thucydides trap. Is America and China inevitably going to clash? It is that sort of scenario that people in Asia are very worried about, and they feel that Australia has no option but to toe with the United States. It is not in a position to say no to anything that the US says. Professor Dombrowski talked about the second pillar of NATO, second pillar of AUKUS, which probably could have been marketed better as a non-military dimension, non-military cooperation between technologically advanced countries, which is fair game. And as you rightly said, it could have roped in other players like Japan and India into it, because these countries are also interested in some of that technology. But it's the defense side, it's that pillar one which makes everybody nervous. And just a quick point on that, thank you for pointing out the difference between the SSBN and the SSNs. I mean, one thing that was a little bit unclear in the AUKUS deal was that after the 3 subs, which will be the initial SSNs, what will be the new generation AUKUS class that is going to be built? Will it be an SSBN or will it be still SSN? I don't think many Australians have got clarity on that. And even the Australian government hasn't said much about what sort of capability those advanced subs will have. And I think this uncertainty
Dr.
makes
Ganguly,
people a little bit
sorry, I think I have to cut you off on that. So I think those questions that you raised purely for time, those are good points of discussion that hopefully that I can talk to you guys again about soon. I know that the next panel is coming up soon, so I wanted to wrap this up. Gentlemen, thank you so much for both of your comments. I want to put in another plug. I know that Dr. Dombrowski already said this, but especially since I'm also a military, I also want to remind the audience that all the opinions shared here during the panel and during the conference are our own opinions and do not indicate any official stances or opinions from any academic, government, country, or military organization that any of us represent. So thank you again, Dr. Ganguly and Dr. Dombrowski, for your time, your presentations, and your knowledge. I'm Captain Brendan Donnelly. Please enjoy the next couple of panels over the next couple of days, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you,
very
Brendan.
much.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Dr. Ganguly.
Thank you.
Take care now.
Take care.